So here today, I want to jump into an interview from Joe Rogan on his podcast with Stephen C. Meyer. And Stephen C. Meyer, if you don't know who he is a leading voice in the world for intelligent design. He is a scientist, and he's written extensively on the scientific evidence that points towards the fact that the best explanation for the world around us is the fact that there is a creator. Now, in the segment that we want to review here today, he's actually diving into the topic of the historicity, the evidence, the reasons, the logic behind believing that Jesus is in fact God, the Son of God. And so it's one thing to believe that science points towards that there must be a creator. Okay, well, which God do we believe in then, right? What angle, what viewpoint do we take? So Stephen C. Meyer goes into this, and he notes right off the beginning here that he's not actually an expert in this, okay? He's a scientist, so this is where more of his expertise is. But he begins to give his personal viewpoints and reasons for believing that Jesus is in fact God, as Joe Rogan starts to ask him, what are your personal beliefs and why do you believe them? So let's jump into this and see where it goes.
I tend to take an evidentialist and philosophical approach to the kinds of questions you're asking, including the question about why I believe the other parts of the Bible, not just about the creation of the universe, but about the historical witness of Jesus Christ, or the Exodus, or things like that. And there I would say my general answer is that I have a strong avocational interest in the historicity of the Bible as one can test it based on external sources of historical evidence from documentary historical sources and archaeological sources. So just a quick thumbnail. And in a way, I'd prefer not to go too deeply into this because I'd rather talk about the ID and the God stuff. And I have
intelligent design, ID. Again, that's more. He's a scientist, right? So that's his expertise.
Stuff. And I have Jewish colleagues, Muslim colleagues, agnostic, non-religious theists, who all agree with me about the scientific evidence and what it points to. And then we have different discussions about. But
I want to know your thought process.
Okay, so my thought process. So, crucial event in, for example, the New Testament is the trial and death of Jesus of Nazareth and subsequent resurrection.
Our Christianity hangs on the fact of the resurrection. If it didn't happen, right, Paul says our faith is useless, it's in vain, it's worthless. And so if the resurrection didn't happen, we're all kind of wasting our time here. And so, to be able to have some logical reasoning behind belief in the resurrection is very key to our faith. I've often said that our faith, our walk with God, it's not a blind faith, right? It shouldn't be a blind faith because I don't think God operates that way. If God is who he says he is, if his word is true as he, proclaims to be, thy word is truth, that there should be some logical, evidential-based reasoning behind it. And so, we'll see where this goes.
One key, really striking thing that I've discovered in my avocational interest in archaeology is that the 5 or 6 leading figures, most important figures in that trial narrative, which take up about a quarter to a third of the 4 Gospels, have all been independently attested by archaeological inscriptions in the last 50 or 60 years. 50
or 60 years. Okay, so even in the last, few decades, there's been more archaeological evidence unearthed, within, modern day Israel and those areas that point to the historical figures in the gospel account. He's going to get into it. Pontius Pilate, Herod. Sometimes people say, well, did these people actually really exist? Did these cities actually really exist? No, they did. These people really existed. There's historical, documents that we have, of course, outside of Christianity that reports of these people. But now there's, even in the last few decades, archaeological, unearthings that point to, no, these people literally did exist. So again, this is not a faith that's rooted in fairy tale. There are some religious religions out there, I won't get into it today, who basically have no archaeological evidence pointing towards the historicity, the reality of those faith groups. But that's not where we stand here today with Christianity.
60 years, there were some construction workers working in Caesarea Maritima in Israel in 1960-ish, turned over a big slab of rock, and on the back was an inscription from Pontius Pilate listing himself as the governor of Judea with a tribute to Tiberius Caesar. Significant because in the Gospels, the ministry of Jesus is reported to have occurred when Tiberius was the Roman emperor, Pilate was the governor, and we know all about in the trial that the key role that Pilate played. Recently,
And what year was this attributed to?
well, it's attributed to the period of time in which Tiberius was emperor. So I think that was 15 through 15 through to 30.
Again, he's not a historian.
The end of his
this guy.
emperorship.
He's a
But
scientist, right?
it's the time mentioned in the New Testament as to when Jesus did his thing. And you have recently in Jerusalem, under the traditional site of the high priest, was discovered a stone ossuary bearing the name of Caiaphas and Caiaphas ben Joseph on two sides of an ornately decorated ossuary containing the bones of someone who was reburied by this practice that the Jews undertook during that unique period of time from about 20 BC to the destruction of the temple. So you have multiple figures from that key event who have been independently attested and established in that time period.
So he's going to get into the resurrection stuff in just a moment, but he's just talking about, again, the reality of the biblical figures. They literally did exist. Now, these aren't the only evidences, okay? He's just going on the stuff that's been unearthed recently, in recent decades. There's all kinds of stuff. I've never been to Israel. Maybe you have. But if you've been there, there's all kinds of historical evidence, archaeological evidence that shows the reality of these historical biblical figures, places, names, cities, people, all of that stuff. This is just stuff that's even more recent, okay, in archaeological findings.
Herod Antipas, we know from his coins and his building projects, Jesus himself, Peter, Annas, the other high priest. So you have these multiple lines of external corroboration for this really important account. And then you have external sources like Josephus and Tacitus. So there's a weight of external corroborating evidence supporting the historicity of these narratives. And that gives you, I think, a good reason to take the narrative seriously and to evaluate their other claims. It's, in fact, a level of corroboration that I think is almost unprecedented for any document that old. So that's
corroboration in terms of the narrative of the stories, or corroboration in terms of the historical figures being real?
both.
You know, some people, or I wish I had the numbers in front of me here, but on studies that I've had over the past, it is actually uncanny. So people wouldn't argue the historicity or the reliability of other ancient historical documents and say, no, that's real. We know that existed in history, whether it's regards to Roman culture, Greek culture, the Roman Empire, stuff like this. And we report it as this is what historically happened. And yet there's more corroborative evidence for the claims in the New Testament to say that, no, these things actually happened. There's more documents that back it up. There's more archaeological digs that show these accounts to be true. There's more evidence basically surrounding the claims of the New Testament than any other secular, if you will, historical document. And it's not even close. I wish I had the numbers in front of me. You can look it up. Maybe I'll find some resources and put it in the description afterwards. But it's very important to know because, again, our faith isn't a blind faith. So let's continue.
In Josephus,
The narrative of the stories being the resurrection of Jesus?
reports of same. You find reports of there's two different texts of Josephus. One that was likely doctored by medieval Christians that historians rightly regard as too affirmative in his expression of belief in Jesus of Nazareth, and one that came to us through the Arabic world, where the Josephus text is much more credible, where he records the basic facts of the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, including being crucified under Pontius Pilate, and then that there were reports that he had appeared to many after being resurrected. So there's a whole
Right, but
The Bible says that Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at one time. One of the things that Joe Rogan kind of gets into in a moment, and you'll see it, is about, well, maybe it was a schizophrenic, talking about James. Well, do we know if he was schizophrenic? The reality is that if Jesus appeared to 500 people at one time, there is no way that 500 people are going to be schizophrenic. Someone would have, together having the same hallucination. Someone would have spoke up. Someone would have said, no, this is crazy. It all would have been debunked pretty quickly. Important to know.
There's reports of Bigfoot.
Well, right, but we have.
No one's hanging their lives. No one's giving their lives for Bigfoot, Joe. Nice try.
I mean,
I love
human
your
being,
I love
particularly back then,
Yeah.
where there's no real access to universal information like the internet. There's no real, there's no libraries. Like, where are you getting all
But nobody is doubting the historicity of other ancient accounts. This is what we're talking about.
your information from?
Right. So you have one of the best formats in all of Talk Anything because you have these long form discussions. But I think even this format will not lend itself to being able to wrestle the question of the
Right. No,
historical real
I don't think we're going to wrestle it. I just want to know why you.
Right. So I think there are three
giving you the
great
reasons, Joe.
scholars who have addressed the question of whether or not actually four. One is Wolfhart Pannenberg, the great German theologian, historian. One is William Lane Craig. One is N.T. Wright with his magisterial tome, The Resurrection of the Son of God. And the other is Gary Habermas. And there are numerous questions that come up in evaluating all this different type of historical testimony regarding that seminal event, if true, in human history.
Right.
And I've done a deep dive on that stuff, and I'm convinced that the resurrection of Jesus Christ happened as a real event in history.
Because people said it did.
Well, because of the various forms of testimony that we have, the historical evidence we have coming down to us from this day. Now, I may be wrong in that. I'm not,
wrong.
as a scholar, arguing on that about that myself.
Right.
But it
He's
is
a
your
scientist.
personal
But it is my personal belief, and I would tell you I have reasons to believe that are well considered, and they are reasons not of subjective experience or subjective experience alone.
Right. Okay. So let's pause here for a moment. He's saying that his faith is not based just on subjective experience. You know what? I believe wholeheartedly that we can have very much a real experience with God, a personal experience, a personal encounter with God. I've had them in my life, stuff that has shaped my life, stuff that has transformed my life, to be honest with you, supernatural things, stuff that you might have a hard time even believing if I were to tell you. That being said, I don't think when we come to faith, again, that it's not a blind faith, right? We don't check our brains at the door when we come to faith in God. No, there needs to be, I believe, a real logical, reasonable explanation that's beyond my subjective encounter with God. Okay, why do I say that? I tell you what, there's been times in my life when I have struggled or doubted things about God and about what God is doing in my life and where He has me and different things like this. You know what? Because of the experiences I've had with God, but also the knowledge that I have and how convinced I am and the evidence about the reliability of Scripture, about who God is, about the fact that nothing explains the universe and our existence better than the fact that there is a Creator, that nothing in my mind that I can see that I've studied would suggest that anyone else's God that is trustworthy other than the evidence of Jesus Christ. It's those logical, factual based reasons that's helped sustain me all these years. Okay, it's not just the personal experience. Yes, that's definitely a big part of it, but it's also the reality of who God is, whether I experience it or not, whether I have this encounter with God or not. God is who He says He is. His word is trustworthy, whether I experience it, whether I feel it or not. That is just the facts of the matter. And so I think it's very important that we settle those things in our hearts. So you need to study those things. We're going to jump into this a little further because I'm rambling on. Let's keep going.
But the reasons that are derived from having examined very detailed historical analyses of the relevant data. And that's probably as far as we could take something in a discussion like this. But I do affirm that belief in such an extraordinary event should be well grounded in historical evidence.
It should be.
And not something that we just believe because we want it to be true.
Well, is it historical evidence or is it historical statements of people who were discussing
There's no other. What kind of evidence are you looking for there, Joe, right? If you're going to know anything about history, it is historical statements. There was no video, like, again, up until, 100 years ago? There was no audio recordings. There was maybe a little more than 100 years. No audio, 150 years. No video. It was all based on what people said and what they wrote down about anything in history. Okay? So keep that in mind.
A thing that may or may not have happened that might have been legend.
Well, much historical evidence is also historical statement. It's testimony,
Sure.
eyewitness or otherwise.
Right, but this is an extraordinary event, right?
Right.
You're talking about a resurrection of a
True.
person who died and
Right,
came back and
right.
was the Son of God. This is a big claim.
Yeah, it is a big claim. What historians must do is evaluate the reliability of historical testimony if what's coming is historical testimony. One piece of historical testimony that's always been extremely compelling to me is the testimony of James, who is mentioned in the New Testament as one of the witnesses to whom Jesus appeared after the alleged resurrection event. He was also mentioned earlier in the New Testament as one of his brothers or half-brothers, depending on whether you're a Protestant or a Catholic Christian, how you view that. But he was mentioned as one of his own family members who did not accept his crazy messianic claims, and he did not believe in him. But something changed James's mind. We later find that he becomes the leader of the Jerusalem Christian church, the early Jewish believers in Jesus.
We're going to pause it right here and just kind of conclude with this. It's getting a little long. James, absolutely certainly, what changed his mind? You know what? He ended up giving his life, martyring himself for belief in Christ being the Messiah, his brother, okay, if you will. Not just James. I mean, you can look at all the apostles, Peter, for goodness sakes, who, denied Christ 3 times, was found in a very cowardly state. And all of a sudden, later on, again, martyring, giving his life for Christ. What changed the attitude, the level of courage, bravery, however you want to label it, with the apostles, all right? From again, abandoning Christ at the cross to all of a sudden selling out their lives for Jesus. I mean, people, and Stephen C. Meyer quotes it down here, and I can't remember who said this. It was one of the early church founders. But basically, the idea of that, people will not, give their lives for a lie. You know what I mean? They'll tell a lie to get out of trouble, but they won't tell a lie to get into trouble, to purposefully get into trouble. That is just something that people don't do. There is no reason, there's no other explanation that you could come up with, that I could come up with, that would explain how the apostles, knowing what was really if this was all fake, if this was all a hoax, if this didn't happen, what would be the incentive for them to give their lives, preach the gospel, end up getting themselves killed for this message? There was no financial incentive, okay? They weren't making money on this. In fact, most of them did not have anything, okay? There was no incentive of power. They were under the oppression of the Roman government, okay, and of the religious elite of the Jewish society that, these were not elite and powerful. There was nothing to be gained materially, socially, okay, financially by preaching this message. In fact, they had everything to lose, earthly speaking. Why would they do this if it wasn't for the fact that Jesus indeed, again, resurrected from the dead, that they fully believed this is what happened? They were fully convinced this is what happened. So we're going to just leave it there today, and hopefully this, maybe you're a skeptic watching this, and maybe this is something that brings a little bit of enlightenment to some of your questions. And if that's the case, I'm thankful that you're watching. But if you have any questions, throw it in the comments. I may or may not have answers. I'm not an expert in this either. I have studied it and read about it for a number of years, but definitely not an expert. But anyways, thanks for watching. God bless you. Have a great day, and maybe we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.